Old farmers running 30 animals through a northern winter did not wait for the hay wagon. They grew the winter feed in summer, stored it in fall, and fed it from October through April without purchasing a single bale. Root cellar crops. The root cellar was not primarily a human food storage system. On a working farm, it was a livestock feed bank. Mangal beets, turnips, and rutabagas, grown through summer and stored in sand or sawdust from October through March, provided the high-moisture, high-energy feed fraction that kept hogs in condition, dairy cows producing, and chickens laying through the coldest months of the year. Mangal beets are the crop that most completely disappeared from American small farming. A well-grown mangal crop yields 30 to 50 tons per acre. Individual roots reach 20 to 40 pounds. One root pulled from the cellar in January feeds a dairy cow for a full day as a high-moisture energy supplement that simultaneously reduces the dry feed ration because of its water content, 75 to 85% moisture by weight. Old farmers planted mangels in May, harvested in October before hard freeze, and stored in a root pit, a trench dug below the frost line, lined with straw, covered with soil, where the roots kept without spoilage until March. 5 months of continuous livestock feed from one planting, no purchased input, no processing. Standing fodder crops. Old farmers did not harvest everything in fall. They left specific crops standing through winter because the frozen and thawed plant was more palatable and easier to feed than anything cut and stored. Fodder kale, tall-growing brassica varieties reaching 4 to 6 feet, was planted in July and left standing through winter. In zones 6 and warmer, a July planting produces continuous harvestable leaf from October through April, 6 months of standing green feed from a single midsummer planting. Sorghum stalks left standing after grain harvest fed cattle and horses through December. The stalk still containing residual sugar and fiber was grazed in place by cattle turned into the field after harvest. No cutting, no storing, no labor. Jerusalem artichoke left in the ground through winter was rooted out by hogs turned into the patch specifically for that purpose. The hogs harvested their own root crop, deposited manure that fertilized the following season's growth, and arrived at spring in good condition without a single day of purchased feed. Stored grain stack. Old farmers did not buy grain. They grew it, stored it, and fed it from on-farm stock. The grain stack, corn, barley, oats, and wheat grown in rotation and stored on the cob or in bins from fall harvest through the following summer, was the primary energy feed for the entire winter. Operation. Field corn stored on the cob in a slatted corn crib, a ventilated wooden structure that allowed airflow around the ears while preventing rodent access. Kept without spoilage for 12 to 18 months. Shelled as needed through winter, it provided the caloric density that root crops and standing fodder could not, the fat and starch fraction that kept draft horses working, hogs gaining, and dairy, cows producing in sub-zero temperatures. The grain stack was sized in summer, not purchased in winter. Old farmers calculated their winter feed requirement before harvest, 30 animals, 120 days of winter feeding, species-specific daily grain requirements, and grew enough surplus to cover that requirement plus a 20% buffer for a hard winter or an unexpected addition to the herd. The buffer was never wasted. Grain that was not needed for winter feeding went into the spring planting or was fed to the breeding animals during the flush of spring production. The on-farm grain stack eliminated the feed store entirely for the energy fraction of the winter ration. It was not a backup plan. It was the primary plan, executed in summer so that winter feed was never a purchasing decision. Fermented feed was not a discovery of modern homesteading. It was standard practice on American farms through the 19th century under the name slop, a mixture of kitchen waste, spoiled grain, buttermilk, whey, and water that was allowed to ferment naturally before being fed to hogs, chickens, and dairy cattle. The fermentation process that old farmers used intuitively is the same lacto-fermentation that modern research has confirmed delivers measurably superior feed efficiency over dry grain. Feed consumption drops 15 to 20% because fermentation increases nutrient bioavailability. Gut health improves because lactobacillus bacteria colonize the digestive tract and competitively exclude pathogens. Animals on fermented feed through winter maintained body condition on less total feed volume than animals on dry grain, which meant the stored grain stack stretched further, and the winter feed supply lasted longer. The slop bucket sat near the kitchen stove in winter, warm enough to maintain active fermentation without freezing, accessible for daily kitchen waste addition. Every vegetable peel, every pot of spoiled porridge, every bucket of buttermilk from churning, every whey drain from cheesemaking went into the slop bucket. Nothing left the kitchen as waste. Everything that could be fermented and fed was fermented and fed. The winter feed supply was extended by every scrap the household generated. Managed woodland browse. Old farmers with woodland on their property did not fence animals away from the woods in winter. They managed woodland access as a deliberate feed source, rotating animals through specific woodland sections on a schedule that allowed browse recovery while providing continuous access to the woody vegetation, fallen mass, dried leaves, and ground-level foraging that woodland provides through winter. Goats and sheep browsed woody stems, dried leaves, and bark from fallen limbs in managed woodland sections from November through March. The browse provided minerals, fiber, and trace nutrients that hay and grain did not supply, particularly copper and zinc from bark and woody stem tissue, which are chronically deficient in hay-dependent winter rations. Animals with woodland browse access through winter required less mineral supplementation than confinement-fed animals on hay alone. Hogs turned into oak and hickory woodland in fall, and early winter harvested acorns and hickory nuts, the mast crop, that provided a high-fat, high-energy supplement that put condition on the animals before butchering season with no purchased input. The practice of finishing hogs on acorn mast, still used in Spanish jamón ibérico production, where it commands the highest pork price in the world, was standard American farm practice through the 19th century and disappeared only when confinement hog production made woodland access logistically inconvenient rather than economically unnecessary. Deep litter foraging. The deep litter method, building up 8 to 12 inches of carbon material in the coop floor through the winter months by adding straw, leaves, and wood shavings on top of the existing litter rather than cleaning it out, was not originally understood as a composting system. Old farmers used it because animals kept warmer on a deep litter bed, because the composting action of the litter generated heat from below, and because chickens and hogs turned into a deep litter bed, actively foraged through it for fermented grain residue, insect larvae, and decomposing organic material. The foraging activity in a well-managed deep litter bed replaces a meaningful fraction of the scratch and grain ration through the winter months. Chickens on deep litter scratch continuously, consuming beetle larvae, pill bugs, fermented grain particles, and fungal mycelium that the decomposing litter produces. Studies of deep litter systems in heritage poultry operations document 10 to 20% reduction in purchased grain consumption in flocks with active deep litter access compared to flocks on bare concrete or wood floors. The litter that comes out of the coop in spring, fully composted, biologically active, pathogen reduced by the heat of the composting process, is the highest quality garden amendment the farm produces all year. Dried legume and seed banks hay provides fiber and moderate energy. It does not provide adequate protein for lactating dairy animals, growing young stock, or breeding animals in the months leading up to spring calving and kidding. Old farmers covered the winter protein requirement, not with purchased protein supplements. Those did not exist, but with dried legume seed stored from the summer harvest. Cowpeas, field peas, dried beans, and sunflower seed harvested in fall and stored in cool, dry conditions through winter provided the protein fraction that standing fodder and root crops could not. A bushel of dried cowpeas, 23 to 25% crude protein, fed to a dairy goat through the winter months maintained milk production at a level that hay alone could not sustain. Sunflower seed at 17 to 20% crude protein and 26 to 32% fat provided both protein and the caloric density needed for winter body condition maintenance. The seed bank was filled in September from the current year's harvest and drawn down through March. What remained in April was the planting stock for the following season's legume and sunflower crop. The system was closed. The protein supply for 30 animals through a 5-month winter cost nothing beyond the labor of growing, harvesting, and storing the crop in summer. 30 animal winter feed calendar to October, mangle beet and turnip harvest into root cellar and root pit, fodder kale standing in field, available for immediate grazing, corn crib full from September harvest, sorghum stalk standing in field for cattle, Jerusalem artichoke patch accessible for hog rooting, slop fermentation running on kitchen waste, deep litter building in coop. November, root cellar crops feeding hogs and dairy animals daily, cattle on sorghum stubble and fodder kale, chickens on deep litter foraging plus reduced grain ration supplemented by slop. Woodland browse rotation begins for goats and sheep, December through January, peak root cellar drawdown. Mangles feeding dairy cattle and hogs, dried cowpea and sunflower seed supplementing protein ration for milking animals. Woodland mast finished, hogs back on stored grain plus fermented slop. Fodder kale still standing in field in zones 6 and warmer. February, root cellar supply at 60 to 70% remaining, grain stack at 50%, fermented feed running continuously. Animals in best condition of winter because the diverse feed stack has covered every nutritional fraction: energy, protein, moisture, minerals, fiber, without a single bale of purchased hay. March through April, remaining root crops fed out, fodder kale finished. Grain stack drawn to 10 to 15% reserve held for spring breeding flush. Pasture beginning in zones 6 and warmer by late March. System closes, summer planting begins. The mineral gap hay is a dried grass crop. What it provides in winter, fiber, moderate energy, some protein, is not the complete picture of what livestock require to maintain health, immunity, and production through 5 months of cold. The mineral fraction is where hay consistently falls short and where old farmers, without knowing the biochemistry, consistently compensated through the diversity of their winter feed stack. Copper and zinc are the two minerals most chronically deficient in hay-dependent winter rations. Both are present in bark, woody stems, and root tissue at levels that dried grass cannot match. Goats and sheep on woodland browse through winter arrive at spring with coat quality, hoof condition, and reproductive performance that hay-fed animals on the same farm do not match, not because of energy or protein difference, but because the browse covered the mineral gap that hay left open. Root crops cover a different fraction. Mangels and turnips pull calcium, phosphorus, and potassium from deep soil layers through their taproot systems and deposit them in the root tissue that livestock consume in January and February. Animals eating roots through winter are receiving minerals that the frozen surface soil cannot provide through any other winter feed source. Old farmers did not use the word bioavailability. They used the word thrift, an animal that was thriving on less. The mineral diversity of a 7-method winter feed stack produced thrift that a single input hay system never could. It did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because purchased hay became cheaper than the labor of growing, harvesting, and storing 7 separate feed crops. And that calculation held as long as hay prices stayed low and farm labor stayed expensive relative to hay cost. That calculation is reversing. Hay prices in drought years now reach $300 to $400 per round bale in parts of the American West. Small farms that built single-input hay dependency are buying feed at prices that eliminate any margin the livestock operation produces. The knowledge that preceded hay dependency did not go anywhere. It is in extension bulletins from the 1880s and 1890s, in farm diaries, in the agricultural press of the 19th century. It works exactly as it worked then. The only thing that changed is whether purchasing a single input was cheaper than growing 7. In an increasing number of U.S. regions, that is no longer true.